Near the central grasslands of the Masai Mara, rain was falling in heavy, unbroken sheets, each drop slanting hard under the push of a wind that flattened the tall grass in long, rippling waves. The air carried the cold bite of a storm that had been building since dawn, sweeping across the plains with a force that drove most animals to shelter. The ground was slick underfoot, with puddles forming in low, uneven hollows where zebra herds normally grazed. Tracks left by larger animals were already filling with water, their edges softening into the mud. Daniel, one of the reserve's senior rangers, moved slowly along the edge of a sodden track, his boots sinking slightly with each step. He had been out checking for stranded wildlife after the storm front moved in, but most of what he had seen so far were the blurred shapes of wildebeest huddled in groups and the distant silhouettes of giraffe seeking the partial cover of scattered acacias. A small, irregular form at the base of one such tree drew his attention. At first it seemed no more than a clump of wind-flattened vegetation or a patch of bare earth darkened by the rain. But as Daniel's gaze fixed on it, a faint tremor passed through the shape, subtle enough to be missed in the sway of the grass. He adjusted his path, approaching with deliberate, steady movements, careful not to startle whatever might be lying there. When he closed the distance, the outline became clear. A lion cub, no more than a few weeks old, half curled on the wet ground. Its coat, a dull gold in the muted light, was slicked flat to the skin, and its small ears drooped under the weight of water. The cub's eyes were half closed, heavy-lidded, as though even the act of keeping them open was too much effort. Its flanks moved shallowly with each breath, ribs faintly visible beneath the damp fur. Every so often a tremor ran along its spine, the kind that comes when a body is losing more heat than it can produce. Daniel knew this was a dangerous sign. In young animals, hypothermia could develop quickly, and once the body temperature dropped too far, recovery was unlikely without immediate warmth. He crouched a short distance away, rain running from the brim of his hood, and scanned the area. No other lions were visible, not in the open grass nor under the nearest trees. The pride that held territory in this sector was known to range further north, and their presence here would normally be marked by spoor, scuffs in the grass, or fresh kills. Here there was nothing but the cub, a scattering of rain-flattened droppings and the smell of damp earth. The cub's head dipped lower, chin nearly touching the ground. Its paws were drawn in close to its chest, but without the restless shifting that might have indicated alertness or discomfort. Instead, its posture suggested exhaustion, the slow collapse of energy reserves. Rainwater streamed from its whiskers in steady drops, and the once fluffy fur around its muzzle was clumped and heavy. A low, thin sound reached Daniel's ears, a cry from the cub, almost lost in the wind. It was not the sharp, insistent call of a hungry but healthy youngster. It was softer, broken at the edges, the voice of an animal that was unsure of being heard. Daniel's eyes swept the horizon again, this time searching for any sign of a returning lioness. There were no fresh prints in the mud near the cub, no disturbance in the grass that might suggest a recent approach. If the mother was alive and searching, she was far enough away that the sound would not carry over the storm. If she had been lost to injury or conflict or had abandoned the cub under pressure from another predator, then this small body before him was now entirely alone. A rumble of thunder rolled overhead, stretching across the plains in a deep, vibrating note. The cub flinched slightly, its ears flicking backward before returning to their droop. A paw twitched once, and then stilled. Daniel let his voice carry quietly over the rain, keeping the tone low and even. "Easy, little one," he said, not in expectation of comprehension, but to keep the rhythm of his presence steady and non-threatening. He shifted his stance so that his body formed a partial barrier against the wind, the rain now striking his back instead of the cub. Carefully, he eased open his waterproof jacket, exposing the inner lining that would help shield the small animal if he chose to lift it. The cub's eyes tracked the movement dimly, the lids lifting a fraction before sagging again, Daniel felt the familiar pull between caution and necessity. Any handling of a wild animal, especially a predator's young, carried risks. To the human, to the animal, and to any chance of natural reunion. But the risk of inaction was also plain. Left here, the cub's body temperature would continue to fall, its breathing would slow, and death could come before the storm had passed. The decision came quickly. He knelt beside the cub, placing one hand just beneath its narrow chest, feeling the thin bones beneath the damp coat. There was little resistance, only a faint stirring of the forelegs against his arm, an instinctive but weakened push. Water dripped from the cub's small rounded ears, pattering against his sleeve. Another flash lit the sky, followed almost instantly by a sharp crack of thunder that rolled away into the distance. Daniel drew the cub closer, tucking it into the fold of his jacket and wrapping the edges over it. He could feel the tremors still passing through its body, each shiver a measure of its failing strength. The air smelt of wet grass and soil, undercut by the faint musk of a lion cub, a scent that in healthy conditions would be stronger, more defined. Now it was muted, as if the storm had washed it thin. Daniel stood, adjusting his grip so the cub's head rested against the crook of his elbow, the jacket forming a cocoon against the wind. His mind remained on the simple reality before him. If he carried it back to shelter, there was a chance to stabilize it. If he left it, there was almost no chance at all. He began walking, each step sinking slightly into the sodden earth. The grass hissed softly in the wind, bending under the weight of water. Somewhere beyond the curtain of rain, the rest of the savanna continued its muted life, herds shifting position, predators waiting out the weather, birds clinging to branches. In his arms, the cub gave a faint, almost imperceptible sound, neither a cry nor a growl, but something in between, like a small note of acknowledgement before slipping back into stillness. The urgency was there, but it was a quiet kind of urgency, the kind that came from knowing time was short, but that rushing would serve no one. Daniel adjusted his pace to steady and deliberate, feeling the cub's slight weight against him. The storm showed no sign of easing, but in the space between each raindrop, the choice had already been made. In this moment, the cub's survival rested entirely on what he did next. Daniel could feel the slight, uneven rhythm of the cub's breathing against his palm as he adjusted his hold, cradling it close to his chest. Its body was alarmingly light, as if the rain had pressed every ounce of strength out of it. He tucked the edges of his jacket tighter, sealing in whatever warmth his own body could offer. The fabric quickly soaked through on the outside, but inside it stayed dry enough to shield the fragile frame. The scent of damp fur rose faintly between them, sharp yet faint, mixing with the deep, earthy smell of the rain-saturated ground beneath his boots. In the distance, thunder rolled low across the plains, a drawn-out growl that seemed to come from every direction at once. A white flash cut across the horizon, bright even through the haze, followed by the sharper crack of lightning meeting earth far away. The path ahead was no longer a clear track but a blur of shadowed shapes and running water. Puddles spread across its surface, the edges vanishing into the darker pools of mud. Streams of rain slid across the ground in thin, quick rivulets pooling at the lower points. The tall grasses that lined the track bowed almost flat under the force of the wind, their stems slick and glistening, tips brushing the ground before swaying back upright only to be flattened again. Daniel leaned forward slightly into the wind, steadying each step to avoid slipping. His boots sank just enough into the softened soil that each movement required extra effort, his muscles working harder to lift against the pull of mud. From inside the folds of the jacket came a sound, a faint, breathy whimper. The cub's call was thin, almost absent of strength, a sound carried more by instinct than by will. Daniel dipped his head, turning his shoulder to the wind to block some of the rain from reaching it. Even through the layers of his jacket he could feel the subtle twitch of its limbs. The brief push and pull of a body trying to respond to the discomfort but too drained to manage more than a weak gesture. Its ears shifted once at the next rumble of thunder, but the movement was small, without any of the quick alertness he would expect from a healthy young lion. The truth was plain. Every moment in the storm was stealing more heat from the cub's small body, and it had little left to spare. In animals this young, the margin between survival and collapse was dangerously narrow. A few more minutes of cold could send its body into the kind of stillness that could not be reversed, no matter the care given later. Daniel's pace stayed deliberate but unbroken. Speed was important, but a slip could cost him more time than moving carefully would. The track curved ahead, bending toward a cluster of trees that grew close together along a shallow rise. Their dark, rain-slick trunks swayed in the wind, branches whipping and twisting under the weight of water. Each gust funneled through the gaps, sending bursts of colder air that stung against exposed skin. Rainwater dripped in heavy, constant streams from the branches, splattering into the already saturated ground. Daniel kept his footing as best he could, shifting his weight with each step so the uneven surface didn't throw him off balance. Inside the jacket, the cub's body shifted slightly again. A soft, uncoordinated movement of its hind legs, followed by stillness. Its head rested against the crook of his elbow, the fine fur along its jaw heavy with moisture, tiny droplets falling one by one onto the inside of his sleeve. Daniel's eyes stayed on the faint outline ahead, where the land dipped and then rose toward the ranger station. Through the curtain of rain, the hut's shape was a muted blur, but it was enough to fix on. Another flash lit the sky, this one closer, brightening the wet world in an instant before fading to the gray-green gloom. The thunder followed faster, a sharper sound that rolled over them almost before the light had gone. Daniel adjusted the jacket around the cub again, careful to keep the fabric from covering its nose and mouth. The small body was cooler than it should be, the tremors inside it weaker than before. He let a few words slip out in a low tone, just above the sound of the rain. "Almost there," he said, the syllables slow and steady. Not to rush, but to remind himself that shelter was close. The wind pressed hard against his side now, pushing at his shoulder and hip with each step. He leaned into it, adjusting his stance so that each stride landed firmly despite the slick ground. His breathing was measured, short bursts visible in the chilled air. Water ran down the back of his neck, gathering under his collar before seeping into his shirt. The weight of the jacket over his front felt heavier now from the combined rain and the small life inside. But it was a weight he did not shift or loosen. The final stretch to the station was the hardest. The ground there had been churned by vehicle tires earlier in the week, and each depression was now filled with muddy water. He stepped carefully between them, avoiding the deepest pools where the mud could pull at his boots. His eyes flicked once more to the cub's face, watching for the subtle rise and fall of breath. It was there, but light, as if each inhale and exhale was a small decision made against the cold. The hut came fully into view at last, its timber walls darkened with rain, the tin roof ringing under the storm's endless strike. The door shook in its frame as the wind pressed against it, the latch rattling faintly. Daniel closed the last few meters quickly but without breaking the careful balance of his steps. When he reached the short steps leading up to the door, he climbed them in 2 strides, planting each boot firmly. His free hand pulled at the latch and the door opened inward with a groan of damp wood and strained hinges. The change in sound was immediate. The storm was still present, but muffled now, its roar softened by the hut's walls. The air inside was warmer by a small degree, but enough to matter. Daniel stepped through without hesitation, closing the door firmly behind him. He knew the next few minutes were crucial. If the cub's body could be warmed gradually and steadily, it might recover. If not, the storm's damage would continue even here. He crossed the small space toward the bench in the far corner, his boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. Every movement remained measured, his attention still fixed on the weight in his arms and the thin thread of life it carried. Outside, the rain continued to hammer the roof in a steady rhythm. But for now, the cub was out of the storm, and the fight to save it had entered its next stage. The air inside the hut was warmer than outside, though only slightly. It held the faint smell of timber, long soaked and dried by seasons of rain. Daniel crossed the floor with careful steps, his arms still wrapped securely around the small shape inside his jacket. On the bench against the wall, he laid the cub on a folded wool blanket, the coarse weave darkening instantly as it absorbed the water dripping from its fur. The animal's sides moved in shallow, uneven rhythm, the skin along its flanks quivering now and then with weak, involuntary tremors. Without pause, Daniel took a dry towel from the shelf and began working it gently along the cub's head, neck, and back, each motion slow and deliberate. The fur was heavy and clumped from the storm, and he could feel the coolness still settled deep beneath the outer coat. Outside, the wind drove rain hard against the tin roof, the sound a constant metallic drumming that seemed to press in from all sides. The cub stirred at the noise, ears twitching faintly, but its eyes stayed only half open, the lids too heavy to lift fully. Daniel moved the towel to its chest and legs, rotating the fabric often so the driest section stayed against its skin. Between passes, he paused just long enough for the cub to rest before continuing, his free hand steadying its small body to keep it from rolling. "Easy now," he murmured, the words quiet, the tone unchanging, meant only to keep his presence familiar in the animal's awareness. When most of the surface water was gone, Daniel adjusted the blanket to cradle the cub and shifted it nearer to the small electric heater in the corner. The air there was warm, but not overly so, and he angled the cub so the heat reached its side without blasting directly onto its face. It lay curled, head resting on the fold of the blanket, paws tucked in close. The rise and fall of its breathing was still fragile, each inhale shallow but steady enough to mark progress. He knew the risk remained. The drop in body temperature from prolonged exposure could still pull it toward collapse if the warmth didn't take hold soon. Minutes passed in the low light. The heater's hum filled the space between the sound of rain and the occasional groan of the hut's timber frame. Daniel fetched a shallow dish and poured in a small measure of warm water, setting it near the cub's head. For a while, there was no response. Then the animal's muzzle lifted just enough to reach the rim. Its tongue flicked twice, drawing in only a small sip before it let its head sink back. The effort was minimal, but in a body this depleted, even a small act meant the will to keep going was still present. Daniel draped a corner of the blanket lightly over the cub's back and sat close, his focus fixed on the slow, rhythmic movements of its breathing. Every so often he adjusted the fold of fabric or the heater's angle, ensuring the warmth spread evenly. The tremors had lessened but had not yet gone. Until they stopped and the muscles beneath the fur felt alive with tone again, he couldn't be certain the worst had passed. Outside, the storm continued without pause, the rain's sharp percussion a reminder of the cold waiting beyond these walls. Inside, the small body on the blanket fought quietly for another hour, another day, while Daniel remained beside it, ready to act if that fight began to falter. The rain weakened to a steady drizzle, the heavy percussion on the roof fading to a softer, uneven patter. The air inside the hut felt warmer now, thick with the scent of wet timber and the faint musk of the cub curled on the blanket near the heater. Daniel had not moved far from it, checking every few minutes for the slow rise and fall of its chest. Outside, the sky was still overcast, the clouds stretched low over the plains, but the sharp edge of the storm had passed. He stepped to the door, opening it just enough to let in the cool air, and paused. The earth beyond the hut had turned into a patchwork of shallow pools and soft mud, each step imprinting sharply into the soaked ground. It was in this soft earth that he saw them, deep, clear paw prints circling the hut. Their size unmistakable. They were fresh, edges sharp, the impression still holding tiny pools of rainwater that had not yet clouded over. The spacing told their own story. Long strides, the gait of a lioness moving slowly but deliberately. Daniel followed the line of tracks with his eyes. They looped wide toward the side of the hut, then back again, crossing over themselves in a restless pattern. He could picture her here not long ago, moving close to the walls, pausing to test the air. A lioness of this size would be fully grown, her paws easily twice the size of the cub's head, her strength enough to end or spare life in a heartbeat. The meaning of her presence was unambiguous. She was searching, and the only thing she could be searching for this close in this direction was the cub sleeping inside. He stepped out a little further, careful where he placed his feet, avoiding the prints so he could read them as they were. Each depression told the same truth. She had come close, perhaps drawn by scent, perhaps by the faint cries the cub had made earlier in the day. He scanned the tree line beyond the clearing, seeing no movement. The air was still heavy with moisture, carrying scents farther than usual. If she was still nearby, she would know he was here. If she had moved on, she could be anywhere in the low, wet grass. The knowledge sharpened the stakes in his mind. A healthy lioness reunited with her cub was the best outcome, but if she perceived him as a threat, the approach could be dangerous. Inside, the cub's condition had improved slightly, but it was not ready to be left outside in the open. Its temperature was still stabilizing, its body still recovering from the hours of exposure. To carry it out too soon might undo all that had been gained. To delay too long could risk missing the chance for them to find each other. He moved slowly around the hut, keeping his senses open for any sound beyond the drip of water from the eaves. The prince stayed close for a while, then trailed off toward the grass, where the wet stalks leaned at odd angles, pressed down by a body that had moved through them. He noted the direction, toward a shallow rise that offered a view of the hut from cover. It was a place a predator might watch from, waiting for the right moment to approach. Daniel stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him. The cub stirred at the shift in air, blinking once before settling again. Its breathing was a little deeper now, the tremors almost gone. The tracks outside had made one thing certain. The storm had not been the end of the danger or the decision. Somewhere in the wet, quiet grass beyond the hut, the lioness was, or had been, close enough to touch, and her search was not over. The clearing lay in a muted silence beneath the lingering gray of the storm, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and grass. Daniel stood just inside the doorway, his eyes fixed on the far edge where the ground dipped into taller cover. She emerged there, her form cutting sharply against the pale, rain-flattened grass. The lioness was drenched, her coat darkened to a deep, tawny brown, water streaming from the curve of her shoulders. Her ears stood high, her head lifted, and her gaze was fixed unbroken on the hut. Even from this distance, there was no mistaking the intensity in her eyes. They searched, assessed, and measured every detail in front of her. Daniel kept still, his posture balanced between readiness and restraint. He knew the signs well enough to understand the line between curiosity and threat could be crossed with little warning. Her muscles were set under the wet fur, neither tensed for a charge nor loose in calm. She shifted her weight slightly, one paw lifting to take a single, measured step forward. The wet ground yielded under her, the print sinking clean and deep. Beyond her stillness lay the truth. She was here for a reason, and the only thing in this hut that could draw her through the storm was the cub lying on the blanket inside. The wind carried faint scents between them, threads of damp vegetation, rain, and the faint musk of the cub that had begun to warm in the shelter. The lioness's nostrils flared once and her tail twitched low, a small arc cutting through the wet grass. Daniel's mind weighed each possible outcome. Stepping out could provoke her. Remaining hidden could make her advance. The cub's breathing behind him had steadied, but it was still fragile. Any movement now had to protect that progress while avoiding the instinctive reaction of a mother who might see only a human standing between her and her young. She moved again, 2 more steps into the open, her paws landing without a sound despite the sodden earth. Water clung to the long hairs of her belly, dripping in steady lines as she paused once more. The muscles in her shoulders shifted, visible even through the rain-dark coat. Her eyes never left his position in the doorway. Daniel eased one hand against the frame, not leaning out, but showing he had no intention of moving toward her. The space between them was still, except for the wind curling through the grass. The balance was a narrow one. If she turned away, it could mean the opportunity for a safe reunion was slipping. If she came too close too fast, the risk to both of them would rise sharply. Daniel let his breathing remain slow, the weight of the moment resting in the knowledge that any choice now could determine whether the cub returned to the wild or remained in human care for far longer than nature intended. The lioness's gaze stayed fixed, unreadable but unwavering, the storm's edge still whispering in the air around them as the distance between them held. Daniel stood at the threshold, the weight of the cub resting lightly in his arms. Its body was warmer now, the tremors softer, but its eyes were still half-lidded, each blink slow. Outside, the lioness held her position at the far edge of the clearing, her body slick with rain, her gaze locked on him. The choice could not be delayed. The longer the cub stayed in his care, the greater the risk of losing the chance for a natural reunion. Moving with measured steps, he crossed the wet ground. The blanket still wrapped loosely around the small frame to shield it from the last spitting drops of rain. When he reached a point halfway between the hut and the clearing's edge, he knelt and set the cub gently onto the flattened grass. It lay there quietly, its ears flicking at the sudden touch of cold earth beneath it. The lioness began to move. Her pace was deliberate, each step pressing deep into the sodden ground, her shoulders rolling with controlled power. Daniel stayed still, his hands at his sides, knowing sudden movement could be read as a threat. She closed the distance to within a few strides of the cub, then paused. The air between them was taut with intent, her breath visible in short bursts, her nostrils flaring as she drew in the layered scents: rain, earth, human, and the musk of her young. For a moment, Daniel expected the inevitable, a swift, direct claim of the cub. But she did not lower her head to take it. Instead, she stepped around it, her path bending toward him. Her tail moved in a slow arc, not raised in alarm, but steady and deliberate. She circled, her body close enough that the heat of her breath reached his arm, damp and warm against the chill of the clearing. Daniel could hear the faint rhythm of it beneath the soft patter of rain. Her eyes stayed on him, the deep amber fixed and unblinking, scanning him as though weighing his presence. Each step of her circuit was unhurried, neither aggressive nor retreating. When she came to stand in front of him again, she lowered her head, the massive curve of her neck dipping until her gaze was level with his knees. It was not a submission, but it was not a challenge either. The gesture was quiet and measured, an unspoken acknowledgement that she understood he was part of why the cub still breathed. The cub gave a faint cry then, a sound that carried only a few meters before being swallowed by the damp air. The lioness turned, walking back toward it with a slow, confident stride, the distance between them closing at last. Daniel did not move, knowing that in this fragile space of recognition, any step forward or back could shatter the balance. The grass swayed gently in the wind, the scent of rain still hanging low, as the moment between man and predator settled into stillness before shifting back toward the wild. The lioness reached the cub without haste, lowering her head until her muzzle brushed lightly over its damp fur. The cub stirred at the contact, a faint muffled sound escaping as it shifted weakly against the grass. Her jaws opened, teeth closing with practiced care around the loose skin at the back of its neck. With one smooth movement, she lifted it clear of the ground, its small limbs dangling in a posture as old as the species itself. The cub hung quietly, instinct keeping it still as she adjusted her grip and straightened. Her stance was balanced and strong despite the long hours she had likely spent searching in the storm. The muscles along her shoulders flexed beneath the rain-slick coat, droplets sliding in thin lines down to the curve of her forelegs. Daniel did not move. His hands remained loose at his sides, the weight of the moment settling between them in the open space of the clearing. He could hear the faint creak of wet grass under her paws as she took a step toward the tree line. Then, unexpectedly, she paused. The cub hung motionless in her jaws, eyes half closed against the cool air. Slowly, the lioness turned her head back toward him. Her gaze was steady, her eyes a deep, clear amber that held no sign of alarm. For a heartbeat, the world beyond that look fell away. The rain's murmur, the soft sway of the grass, leaving only the quiet exchange between two beings who had each, in their own way, carried the cub through the storm. It was not human gratitude, not anything that could be mistaken for it, but it was a pause that felt deliberate. A moment of stillness where she neither advanced nor retreated, as if she had measured him and found no reason to rush the space between them. The air smelt of wet earth, and the faint musk of lion carried low in the heavy air. Daniel gave no sign to break the moment, holding his ground until she turned away again. Her body shifted back into motion, muscles rolling in fluid rhythm as she crossed the clearing toward the high grass. The cub swayed gently in her hold, its head angled toward her chest. She stepped into the cover of the grass, the pale stems bending and parting around her before closing again in her wake. In a few strides, she was gone from sight, her passage marked only by the faint ripple of movement in the grass and the soft sound of it returning to stillness. Daniel stayed where he was, the clearing empty once more, save for the faint trail of paw prints already softening in the damp ground. The wind moved through the grass in long, quiet waves, and the air felt lighter than it had when the storm began. The grass swallowed their shapes quickly, the lioness moving with a steady, unhurried gait, the cub swaying gently from her jaws. Each step left a dark print in the softened earth, but the trail blurred almost as soon as it was made, the damp blades leaning back into place. The clearing, moments ago alive with the tension of her presence, now felt still, the quiet deepened by the sudden absence of movement. The air was lighter than it had been all day, the storm's weight lifted, leaving only the smell of wet soil and the faint musk she had carried with her. Daniel stayed where he was, his boots firm in the mud, his eyes following the faint ripple of grass until even that was gone. There was no sound of parting branches or breaking stems, only the soft rustle of wind passing through the open ground. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving drops clinging to the tips of the grass, each catching what little light filtered through the clouds. Overhead, the thick gray began to thin, and from a narrow break in the cover, a pale beam of sunlight stretched down, touching the clearing in a single, muted glow. It fell across the place where the cub had lain, the flattened grass still dark with damp, the shape of its small body imprinted faintly in the blades. Daniel's eyes lingered there for a moment before shifting to the spot where the lioness had first appeared, a space now empty, save for the faint depressions her paws had left in the mud. He exhaled slowly, the breath carrying the last of the tension that had held him still for so long. The cub was back where it belonged, its fate now guided by the one best able to protect it. The risk had been real from the first moment he had seen it in the rain. The cold, the distance from its mother, the uncertainty of whether she would return. Each choice since then had been weighed against that simple truth. Without action, it would not have survived the storm. Daniel stepped back toward the hut, his pace unhurried now, his boots brushing against the wet grass. He paused once to look over his shoulder, scanning the horizon. The tall grass stood unbroken in every direction. The clearing again just a quiet patch in the expanse of the reserve. In his mind, the image of her turning to look back at him remained clear. Not gratitude, not anything that belonged to human thought, but an acknowledgment all the same. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain's end, clean and cool. Above, the sun edged a little further into view, casting long threads of gold across the wet ground. Daniel stood for a final moment, letting the sound of the grass moving in the breeze settle in his ears before turning back toward the shelter, the memory of that silent exchange set firmly in place.